This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank my latest rater and reviewer, Trevor. Thank you so much for rating the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on podchaser.com and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast, and to John Monson and the Galaxy Brothers for the interlude music. In today's interview, my guest, Ian Redfearn, is very powerfully moved by music, and he mentions a number of songs early in the deconversion process that were deeply meaningful for him. I've also asked him to send me a Spotify playlist and some recommendations on songs that were meaningful to him. He's going to mention some in the interview, and I will have links in the show notes also. One of my favorites was recommended by Ryan Bell, and that is A Great Big World's Say Something, I'm Giving Up on You. It's such a powerful allegory of what it is like to finally let go of God, of succumbing to the deafening silence and moving on. But this got me to thinking, what is your favorite deconversion song? I would love for you to share your favorite deconversion song with the hashtag deconversion song. We'll try to gather some of these together. If you happen to listen on Spotify, we can, in a future episode, compile a Spotify playlist and make that available. But mostly what I'm interested in is how music has played a part for you in the process of deconstruction and deconversion. On to today's show. My guest today is Ian Redfearn. Ian deconverted over 12 years ago and is very interested in what happens now post-deconversion. Ian reached out to me and wanted to tell more than just his deconversion story, but also how he makes meaning in his own life. And this meaning is hard-won. As you're going to hear, his 24-year-old son has cystic fibrosis, which affects the lungs. So during a pandemic that is airborne, this must have been an incredibly frightening time for Ian and his family. Ian's father also is suffering from Alzheimer's disease, so Ian has been through quite a lot in the last year. But what you're going to hear is that there is a joy in Ian. He expresses this very well. He has learned that it is the relationships in his life that are of the greatest and highest meaning, and he recognizes the need to be vulnerable with one another. I plan to expound upon this concept a bit in the final thoughts section, so hang on for that. But one of the things that I find amazing in doing these interviews is how we have each of us individually derived very similar ideas. What Ian is expressing, you could call secular grace. He doesn't put a term on it, but that is what he is describing. It's one of those magical moments when you meet somebody who is expressing ideas that you've been trying to articulate for quite some time. I really, really loved my conversation with Ian, and I'm very glad for you to hear it. Here is Ian Redfearn. Ian Redfearn, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you, David.
Ian, again, thank you for reaching out to me. You had mentioned that you want to talk a bit about life after deconversion and still asking the questions about your religion or your former religious experiences and what to do now. That's where we're going to spend most of our time today, but I do want to hear the story of how we got to now. So what was your faith tradition like, and maybe what the doubts were that led you to deconversion?
Okay, David. So briefly, if possible, I became a Christian at the age of 18 after being brought up in the Methodist Church in the UK. The Methodist Church in the UK is, I think, a little bit different for you guys in the US. It's a very kind of traditional structure in many ways. So Sunday morning service would be the hymn sandwich, 5 hymns, a reading, Sunday school for the kids, and a very boring sermon. And that's all much I remember about it. And the first opportunity I had as a teenager to stop going, I did. I stopped attending church. But as I sort of went through my later teenage years and age 17, 18, um, really as an insecure 18-year-old struggling with my identity, I guess, in many ways. And just before going away to university, so age 18, I was about to start university in Newcastle, which is in the northeast of England, to study as a dentist. So all looking good. But as a consequence of being exposed to a number of young people my age who talked about Jesus as if he was a real person, who clearly had a real relationship with this person called Jesus, and talked about him and the difference that Jesus made in their lives, I'd been exposed to the gospel on a number of occasions, including hearing Billy Graham. Your very own Billy Graham came over to the UK in 1985 and preached in a number of football stadiums up and down the country. So I went on a coach to hear Billy Graham speak at Anfield, the home of Liverpool Football Club,
Okay.
and heard the gospel, and he made the call, and I saw the crowds go down onto the football pitch to become Christian, including a friend of mine I went with. I didn't go forward. I somehow convinced myself that there was no need for me to do that. But I would say a few months later, I was by myself in my bedroom, and I'd been reading a small book by that told the story of a small fellowship in a farm in Yorkshire. The book was called Miracle Valley, and the farm's called Hollybush Farm. In fact, it's still there. There's still a church active. I was looking the other night, so there's still an active Christian fellowship there, and it's a remarkable story as told in this small paperback in terms of God's faithfulness, God turning up and giving these people this vision to start this church, and the miracles they'd seen in this church, hence the name Miracle Valley. And I just knew I needed God in my life. Now,
Yeah.
if you asked me my testimony as a Christian, I would have said that, well, my life was looking good. I was going to, I'd succeeded in my exams. I was going to start at university. I was looking forward to going to university. I was going to train to be a dentist. So my life was all planned out.
Right.
But I just felt I needed that my life was incomplete without God. And that would have been my story. Whereas in reality, I think looking back, I was in many ways quite an insecure teenager, and I was quite nervous. In fact, I was terrified about going away to university,
Right.
and the prospect, the promise of a God who had a plan for my life, who was going to be with me and walk by my side. When God's for you, who can be against you? So
Right. Right.
that kind of rang true, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I did. I asked Jesus into my heart. I was knelt at my bed, and I can remember having a very real encounter as I felt with God at the time. Going downstairs, telling my mum, who was also an active Christian, so she was very happy about this. And there's no doubt that for me, being a Christian university was in many ways a positive experience, because you're
Okay.
immediately keyed into a whole group of people there, like-minded. I made some friendships there that would have been lifelong.
Yeah.
Part of the so-called Methodist Society, or METHSOC for short, as it was called. Exposed to a number of church traditions while I was there. So the church I went to first of all was a Assemblies of God, so a Pentecostal type church. So I
Uh-huh.
was well into the whole charismatic thing from the very beginning, really, and that certainly helped to strengthen my faith at the time. Moved to a different part of the city later on, and ended up going to a Brethren church, which was so in many ways at the opposite end of the
Yeah.
faith spectrum.
Yes, that's a big jump, a big change.
Absolutely, it's a total other end of the Protestant spectrum, to say the least. That was so from a big, several hundred congregation Assemblies of God, happy clappy, to a small, little more than a wooden hut, really. The
Okay.
reason I went was this church was literally next door to the where I was living at the time, so I could get up at 10 to 11 and still make church. I'm not going to lie, it certainly served a purpose.
Okay.
But I did enjoy it. It was a very different experience. And it was, the women had their hairs, they had head coverings. They weren't allowed to speak in church, but they were genuinely loving people,
Right.
and so I felt fairly comfortable with that. So I had numerous encounters with God. I knew God's presence. I had a living, ongoing relationship with God. I had experience of God in my life, as I would call it at the time. I
Right.
remember the first summer after being at university, I took part in a couple of missions. Actually, this was an opportunity to go and spread the good news. And I went on a mission. This was organised within the Methodist Church, They had an outreach to a number of villages in the southwest of England, which is a beautiful part of the country if you ever get the opportunity to visit.
Okay.
We were in a village in Dartmoor, and part of a small Methodist church there. We slept on the floor in the village hall, and we did door to door. We ran various social events, all the kind of stuff that you do as an evangelical Christian. And I can remember very clearly one morning going for my quiet time and going for a walk just up a country lane, just out to the village. Beautiful spot overlooking a field, and praying and having an absolute conviction that basically God spoke to me and told me that I was going to be a leader of a church.
Mm,
I interpret that as being I was going to be like a pastor of a church or a minister in some sort.
right.
And that was that, I remember coming away shaking from that, thinking, wow,
Yeah.
and telling people about it. And that's, that dominated a lot of my Christian life since. So, 5 years at university, identifying as a Christian, marrying my wife Sarah the year after I qualified as a dentist. I met Sarah through the Methodist MethSoc. And, I married Sarah after praying, asking God if that was the right thing to do, and feeling that God said, "Yep, you go ahead." So, every decision I've made, where we moved to, was based on a conviction that this is what God wanted for us. We
Right.
settled in the northwest of England, near Manchester, and where and started going to a church in a town called Nelson, which is the town where I still work now. That's the practice I started in 1991. I will be there 30 years
Wow.
this year, which is a terrifying thought. But
Yeah.
I'm actually very, very grateful for it.
Yeah.
It's been a fantastic experience. So yeah, so we attended a church in the town of Nelson called the Mission, which was an independent evangelical church. And again, it was, and we felt at home there. It was quite diverse. There was definitely a charismatic wing within the church, which is what we gravitated towards. There were other expressions of Christianity, and a degree of tension between certain groups, I would say. Perhaps unusually for the church in the UK, there were, and there happened to be a couple of the leaders who were actually very much into a young earth creationism. Now, that's not really a major movement in the UK,
Okay.
I'm glad to say, but we did have it in our church, strangely, in that, a couple of ministers of the leaders, there'd be a table at the back of the church with the Answers in Genesis magazines there. And they even insisted on a number of years after we'd been there, while we'd been there, on getting an Answers in Genesis speaker to come along. And that was one of the marker points in my journey, I guess, out of the church and ultimately out of Christianity, because
Okay.
I just felt that was a fundamental mistake for all sorts of reasons. But you've explored young Earth creationism enough times on your podcast because we don't need to dig over that one. But that was one of the staging posts, and like many of the stories that you've heard, I can't pick on a specific moment where
Right.
my faith began to deconstruct, but it was a long process for me, over a couple of 2 or 3 years, I would say.
Okay.
And it was a bereavement. It is as you've rightly explored with other people, this is a difficult process.
Yeah.
Yes, it was an intellectual process, but actually it was much more deeper than that. I was caught in that sense of the disparity between what I was hearing being preached to the front, what the Bible was telling me, what the books were telling me, but the disparity between what they claimed God was doing to the reality of what I was experiencing in my life and what I saw was happening in the lives of those around me. That cognitive dissonance is an uncomfortable place to be, isn't
It
it?
sure is. Yes.
So there's been issues with my eldest child, which we'll talk about in a moment. That was, I guess, a little bit of the process as well. But to cut a very long story short, it's almost 12 years ago to the day, because I do have it in my diary. And my wife and I, we were going to go and see a band play, one of our favourite groups,
Okay.
a group called Elbow. Don't know if you heard of them. They're an amazing band. They were playing in Blackpool, and we went out for a meal just before to go and see this band playing.
Okay.
And I can remember, my wife sitting across the table, and me saying to Sarah, Sarah, this whole church thing, I just cannot do it anymore.
Wow.
And thankfully, and I guess I must have known in my heart, and her third journey's been different, so I can't speak on her behalf, but thankfully she felt in the same place. So I'm very grateful for the fact that we reached the same point at more or less the same time, where we both decided, no, we're not doing this church thing anymore.
Right. Wow. That's great.
I am grateful for that. as you've explored with lots of your contributors in the past, and thank you for doing that. This is difficult. It is a bereavement. Losing and walking away from your faith, walking away from a relationship with God, and walking away from a community, from your family, your church family. It does hurt. And I remember being terrified and elated at the same time. And I
Yeah.
tell you what, that gig, Elbow, was incredible. It was an amazing night. But that was the moment. And I didn't use the word atheist. I didn't use the word agnostic. I couldn't even say the word atheist. It
Sure.
didn't feel right in my mouth until some time afterward. But that was the moment 12 years ago, and here I am 12 years later, still thinking about it, still exploring it,
Right.
still asking the question why. And that's it's interesting. It's interesting to try and figure out what it is about me and my psyche that means that led me into that relationship with God, and why now there's still a I like to use the phrase just to because it kind of baits some people,
Uh-huh.
but there's still a God-shaped hole in my life,
Okay, got it.
and I'm still picking at that scab.
Yes. All right, so that's some of what I think we need to explore. I think I want to start with, I love that you are using the term bereavement.
Yeah,
There is the atheist debate culture out there where there's kind of this snarky attitude of, even if I was proven that God existed, I wouldn't want to worship him. And
yeah.
I think that there are a few of us, maybe not all of us, but a few of us where that just isn't the case. If I could have held on to faith, if I could have continued to believe, I think I would have wanted to. And there very much was a sense of bereavement for me, and it sounds like that's similar for you.
I can remember another moment that illustrates that perhaps better than anything else was so a few months prior to the moment of deciding, that conversation with Sarah, I went to another gig, this time in Manchester,
Okay.
with a good friend of mine. So one of my friends from university, a guy called Graham, who is a Methodist minister, still is a Methodist minister. And we went to see one of our favourite bands, a band called Low,
Okay.
who are actually from Utah. And if you don't know them, they're amazing. And from a Mormon family, actually, and they still have a Mormon faith. Anyway, we went to see them play in Manchester, and they were playing through one of they have the best Christmas album that
Interesting.
anyone's ever done. It's incredible, and they were playing that from start to finish, and this was going to be a great gig. But I went along to would hear Low in this fairly small venue in Manchester in the university, and it was actually the support band that came on, and they were a band called Ida, who I'd never heard of. And I was really struggling with this whole thing. I don't know that I'd even spoken to Graham about this at the time. Graham I'd known since 1985 when I first started university. So we'd been at Methsot together. And like I say, he's now a Methodist minister. But Ida played this song, For Shame of Doing Wrong. And it's a beautiful song. And it's nothing to do with Christianity or faith at all in any way. But it was just, the emotion of being in a gig, and B, this particular song. And there's this one line. And this whole song's all about losing a relationship. I think it's about the breakdown of a relationships.
Right.
And one of the lines is, "Let me be a fool for you again."
Mm.
And that just seemed to articulate exactly what I was crying out to God. I felt I was hanging on with my fingertips to God, saying, "God, just let me be a fool for you again. If only you just give me the merest glimpse that you are still there, and that I can trust in you."
Right.
And I cried. I cried in that gig. That was a deeply, even now thinking about it, was a deeply moving moment, as this relationship that meant so much to me was finally disappearing, like sand between my fingers, just draining away.
I've said on the podcast before, but Ryan Bell has pointed out a great big world song, "Say Something, I'm Giving Up on You."
Okay, I shall look for that.
Yeah, that has the same place for me. Of
There you go.
It was a bit after the fact, but still, it's about a relationship. It's not about God, but it definitely describes that. Just please, please do something, say something.
Oh,
It
absolutely.
just, or I have to walk away for my own sake, kind of thing. So that sounds like it's very, very similar.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. So when I people's response when we first left and we let people know,
Hmm.
people's response, because I was I guess I kind of perceived as being a fairly informed, maybe intellectual. I'm not sure
Sure.
that I was actually. In fact, I know I wasn't. In terms of my faith, I just knew a little bit more about stuff than perhaps the other people I was talking to, and that's how I winged it most of the time.
Yeah.
But the response of a lot of people was just to send me books, and it was really interesting. So one brother who was and still is a Christian, he sent me a load of apologetic type books.
Okay.
After giving me a phone, he gave me a phone call and gave me a bit of a telling off, sent all these books to me. Whereas the other brother, who was and still is an atheist, he sent me God Delusion and
Okay.
all the classic Four Horsemen type books.
Right.
None of which I've read actually, apart from Hitchens. I have read Hitchens, but the other ones I've never read, interestingly, because I guess the interpretation was I'd reached an intellectual point where I could no longer believe Christianity. I know that's true, that is part of it. It was actually much more fundamental than that. It just wasn't working. The gap between what I was hearing and the claims about God and the claims that what God was doing in the lives of people and in the world versus the reality of what I was seeing in my own life and the life of those around me, I just could not hold that together anymore. That cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable place, which so many of people who you've spoken to, sometimes we sit in that place for years, we stew in it, we go around that for years and years, trying to hold it together, trying to dampen those voices of doubt by whatever means necessary. And it is an uncomfortable place to be, and a lot of people just stay in that place. But I just couldn't do it anymore, and for my own sanity, it was in many ways as much an emotional response as it was an intellectual response.
Right.
And it's only since then, really since then, and particularly for some bizarre reason over the past which we'll perhaps come on to later, the past year, in fact less than that, the past few months, I've actually revisited the intellectual side of it all in terms of the basis for faith or lack of, and that's been an interesting journey for the past few months.
Man, I want to respond to several things that you've said there. First off, I think is looking at the apologetics. Like I had a good friend of mine, really my best friend, and I'm hoping to have him on the podcast one of these days. He's still a believer, and the first thing he did was send me, a bunch of Lee Strobel books.
Yeah. Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And because I love my friend, I was like, all right, I'll give it a spin. I'll reread these, and I did, and of course they're terrible. And and it's like, how do you respond? I can't explain how flawed these arguments are without tearing apart his faith. So I said
Absolutely.
I'd find them unconvincing, and I would just hint around at what some of those issues were. The other thing that you said is really, really important, that it's not just about the intellectual side, but it sounds like to me, Ian, is that you took seriously the idea of God being a real part of your life and a real part of intervening in the world. And when the disparity between that taking it seriously belief that God is active and the reality of the world we actually live in is, as you say, a cognitive dissonance that is very, very difficult to maintain for very long.
Yeah. So I very rarely get the opportunity to have this conversation in terms of exploring this whole journey. Interesting, as an aside, Sarah, once she said no and walked away, that was it. And she was and still is absolutely bemused that here I am 12 years later, still looking at it, talking about it. As far as she's concerned, done and dusted, moved on,
Okay.
and good for her, absolutely.
Yes.
But for me, I've always wanted to talk about it and to explore it because I'm still figuring it out.
Yeah.
And certainly, from a position of integrity, I I got it wrong once. I have to be open to the possibility I've got it wrong again,
Sure.
and maybe. So, and I can't imagine the circumstances that would change, but I have to be open to that.
Yes.
But what I've learned is, when people, particularly you have the conversation with people who've not seen you for a while, but say if, patients who come and see me and they ask how what's going on with church, and I've learned, you have the short answer or the long answer,
Yeah.
and the short answer to when people ask why did you leave it, I say it came down to credibility and integrity.
Mm.
So credibility in terms of, I no longer found it credible to talk about a loving interventionist God against the reality of what was going on in my life and the life of those around me and in the world, and integrity in that I just I couldn't keep on pretending. And that was it. That was my journey down to credibility and integrity.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that internal integrity as well. You can no longer fool yourself.
100%. I can't fool myself, but I've always admired integrity in other people. I have nothing but the greatest admiration for Christians who, with integrity, hold it together. And just as an aside, as you said, this is a painful experience. And although I must confess, when I first deconverted, I was quite evangelistic about my
Sure.
newfound atheism. And for a
Yes.
brief period of time, I was anxious to tell people there wasn't a God. Don't worry about it. Just get on with your lives.
Yeah.
I very quickly moved up from that, and I would actually, personally, I would hate to feel I was responsible for anybody losing their faith. I don't want that on me.
Right.
Someone's going on that journey and they want to talk about it, I will of course talk about it, but I am not in this game to try and convince anybody to walk away from something that's important to them. And lots of people, their faith is an important part of their lives and they are better people for it.
Right.
I've always been very uncomfortable with the line that all religion is wrong, because it's not.
Right.
The reality is, there's that faith is an important part and motivates some people to do a lot of incredibly good things. Not just Christianity. I know a lot of my Muslim friends.
Yeah.
They are good people. They are genuine people, and their faith is an integral part of that. And I do not want to be responsible for undermining that for anybody.
I completely agree. It's really interesting. One of the things I love about doing this podcast is that we've kind of independently derived this, right? This idea
Yeah,
of respect for believers and in my terminology, grace for them. That recognizing I used to be in that place and that used to be important to me, and it's an integral part of that person. And so I don't have any desire to go sweep the rug out from underneath someone else and their faith.
absolutely not. No, and I think what you're doing. Just as an aside, this podcast, this what you're doing with this, David, is so important for that, because this is the conversation that doesn't take place enough. And I know for me personally, finding your podcast over the past few months has been tremendously helpful. So thank you for all you're doing.
Ah, well, I greatly appreciate that. It's good to hear that what I'm trying to put out in the world is being received. So,
I promise you,
yeah.
absolutely.
You have in your family some health issues that I think were pretty integral in maybe asking some of these hard questions. You want to talk about that?
So yes and no.
Okay.
So my eldest son Sam. So Sam is 24. Sam has cystic fibrosis.
Okay.
So for those who don't know, cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease. So he was born with it, and it does all sorts of horrible things to you. The main feature of it, it basically messes up with the lungs. So
Okay.
over a period of time, his lungs have deteriorated. Now, so Sam was born. When Sam was born, we were so very, we were, and for many years afterwards, very much, faithful Christians.
Right.
And although it was, of course, it was a difficult time, and it did raise questions. Of course, it did. It never caused me to doubt, not in any way. Interestingly,
Okay.
I can remember being feeling very supported by the church at the time as we dealt with this mystery.
Yeah.
We could just have to trust God with this. And I can also remember maybe preaching about it, or remember maybe some Bible study or some small group talking about this whole experience,
Right.
and maybe exploring the question, what's it like? Does that cause you to doubt? And I remember, and with absolute sincerity, saying, well, no one knows more what it's like to see their son suffer and die than God Himself, God the Father. So I
Wow.
actually found profound comfort in that
Sure.
concept that God more than anything knows what it is like to be a father, to see their child suffer. But yeah, that has been part of our mood music ever since. The reality is, my son, he's so he's now 24, as I say. He's at home with us. He's on an oxygen machine most of the time.
Oh, wow.
He's supplemental oxygen to be able to breathe. So his life, in many ways, is very, very limited.
Okay.
And so, particularly as you can imagine, through this whole period of COVID, that's been
Oh,
a whole new challenge.
yeah. I just want to stop and say I am so sorry. That must be terrifying. We're all going through, difficult times, but I just can't imagine having a loved one with risk to their ability to breathe.
Yeah, it does feel like a perfect storm, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But because I've had 24 years of getting used to the idea, I've had 24 years of getting used to the idea that I will bury my son,
Mm. Oh, man.
which is obviously is a horrible situation to be in, but there is light in that. It does give you a different perspective. It does change your value system.
Mm.
I'm not going to pretend it's not been. Of course, it's been horrendously difficult. I mean,
Right.
I'm speaking to you in front of my laptop here, and on my laptop there is a file called Sam's funeral because,
Oh,
in actual fact, this time at the beginning of 2020, before COVID even hit, that Christmas, Sam was incredibly unwell, and we were really at that point then planning for end of life
oh,
and.
man. I'm so sorry.
So that's yes, not many people have a file on their computer, planning for that. But
Right.
that's just the way I deal with stuff, I guess. Now here we are, but here we are, some 15 months later, and Sam's still with us, and for all sorts of reasons, which I well, no, that one I will say on this podcast, I'm incredibly grateful for the NHS, which is a remarkable institution over here.
Yes.
He's access to all kinds of treatment, which we don't have to worry about paying for, including some relatively new medication that's no doubt stabilized him.
Right.
And that's why he's alive now and still with us.
Yes.
And, he's now beginning to explore various other options. We've still got a difficult path ahead of us, but, we've had him he's with us for at least another year. And he's actually slightly better than he was at the beginning of the year. And in many of those ways, his quality of life has improved.
Mm. Okay.
Lockdown for a lot of us has been very difficult, but Sam's been living in lockdown for a number of years,
Right.
so he's kind of used to this. And the internet and these kind of conversations, and in many ways, he's got a better social life than me at the moment.
Okay.
Whenever
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sat in the office, I can hear him chatting and laughing away on various forums,
Right.
things I don't even pretend. Oh, I'm getting old now. On Discord,
Right.
he's a moderator on some kind of Discord server, and I'm hearing chatting away and all sorts of stuff from that.
Yeah.
Plus other new relationships that he's formed recently. This year has been he's done okay
Okay.
despite COVID, and because of his condition, he's now had his vaccination. Because of my job as a frontline health worker, I've had my vaccination as well.
Excellent.
So we end the year feeling slightly more confident than we did.
I'm so glad to hear that.
But yeah, that's been difficult. It's also been a difficult year because of, unfortunately, my father has deteriorated significantly with Alzheimer's, and being apart from
Wow.
that has been another massive challenge. Not least, of course, for my mum, who's had to deal with that
Yeah.
virtually by herself, which is a cruel, cruel thing.
Man, Ian, you've had a rough,
Oh
rough
man, I
year.
know,
Oh man, I'm
I
I'm
know.
feeling for you, my friend. Seriously, that's a lot. That's a lot all at one time. So
It's what's the alternative? Either you deal with it or you don't.
right.
And don't get me wrong, there's been some very black moments, and I've needed a lot of help, but it is what it is. And so here you go. That's one. At least now, I do not have to try. I do not torture myself with the question, "What is God's plan in this?"
Exactly. Ah.
What is God's will in this situation?
Yeah.
You know, I will. I'm no longer having to cry out to God, I will trust in you, because I can just sit here and say, wow, bloody hell, shit happens.
Exactly.
It turns the roll of the dice, but that's what it is in this cosmic game. This is the cards I've been dealt with, and it's up to me to deal with it. And I tell you what, that's an awful lot easier to do than attempt to reconcile that with some sort of deity that cares for you.
I think that is really a significant thing you've just said there. That there's this added layer to you're already hurting if you have loved ones in danger, and you also have this obligation to protect God,
Absolutely.
to make meaning out of that in some way. Without that, you can just grieve. It's terrible.
Yeah.
This is jacked up. It's wrong. It's terrible that you have to suffer like this and your family members have to suffer like that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But you can hit that head on and grieve together instead of feeling obligated to protect a deity.
Absolutely. And it's so obviously it's been very interesting the past few months listening to various, no, I say very numerous podcasts. And it has been mainly podcasts, and you're very apologist trying to deal with the whole issue of suffering.
Right.
And you kind of think, nah, this doesn't really work. There's no possible way you can reconcile this.
Right.
And they can't.
Back to our apologetic talk for just a minute. I've said before, if you believe in divine hiddenness, that's fine.
Yep.
But if you believe in
Yep.
divine hiddenness and the God of the Bible, that's the problem, right? Like the God of the Bible is active and participating, and any explanation of why that active participating God isn't active and participating is shooting yourself in the foot.
There's what is interesting. As I say, I admire integrity, and so listening to particularly podcasts on the Unbelievables, so Justin's podcasts, and on a number of occasions the various Calvinists on, and or from the Reformed evangelical wing of the church, and in some way. And I can see how they kind of hold together. If you have an absolute belief in the absolute sovereignty of God, and that all that happens, everything in the world, in the universe, is purely for his glory, then in some way that actually allows people to part the whole issue of why is this happening to me?
Right.
Because you don't ask the question.
Yeah.
What right have I got to even ask that question?
Yeah.
I let it go. I trust that God has a plan, and that's all I need to do. And you know what? I've sometimes explored, as a thought experiment, I kind of think, if I ever was to go back to Christianity, what would that look like? And there've been moments when I kind of think, well, do you know what? Could I become a Calvinist?
Yeah. Okay.
Because that kind of holds it together. And also, what's interesting, actually, I mean, I'm very grateful because of where I work in the community I work among, and also various friends. I have a number of Muslim friends, and lots of wonderful Muslim patients as well, actually, who all ask after Sam.
Right.
Some beautiful people. I've had the number of. I've got a whole there's a whole group of older Muslim women who I've got to know over the years, and they always ask about Sam, and they always say they're praying for Sam, and I take that for what it is, and I'm sincerely grateful as they reach out.
Right.
So, but in Islam, there's an absolute belief in the absolute sovereignty of God.
Right.
Inshallah, it's God's will, God willing. And that's all you can believe. That's all God has a higher plan. He is the supreme being with a plan, and it's not for us to doubt. I've been told by on two separate occasions by two different Muslim friends, Ian, you'd make a great Muslim, and I think I love that. I actually I take that as a genuine compliment.
Right.
I love that. And yeah, I think there's actually, and I'm sure someone's looked at this. I think the similarity between the Muslim attitude, the concept of sovereignty of God, and the Reformed Calvinist view of sovereignty of God are very similar,
Right.
if not the same.
Yeah.
So that, as a worldview, in terms of dealing with suffering, from an integrity point of view, actually kind of works as well.
I think that is the draw, right?
Yes.
It sounds like you listened to the podcast, so you probably heard me say that, people either go down the road of charismatic, Pentecostal, very, experiential, or they go down the road of moralism in some way or another, or they go down the road of Calvinism. And I think the draw of Calvinism, even though there are dark sides to it, I know my listeners are leaping up and down right now, but the upside to it is just what you described, is that
Yep.
the idea of a truly sovereign God who literally has control of everything is comforting, right? There's no denying that.
Yeah, that we're here for God's glory. That's what matters. It's not about the love of God necessarily. It's about the glory of God. It's all to His glory. That's all that matters. And that, I can see the attraction of that. There's also some appalling and horrible
Yes.
consequences of that
Yes.
view. Once you begin to explore it,
As long as you don't take the next step. Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, don't go there. Because it's absolutely hideous. But yeah.
So, Ian, another thing I think that you're expressing really well is, and I don't know if this is a personality type, but I find that I'm similar as well, that not everyone is interested in having these deep conversations.
No.
My experience too of my secular friends who never had a religious experience, they'll humor me, right? They'll engage in some philosophy and things like that, but they aren't really interested in spending 3 hours
Yep.
discussing
Yep.
where do we get meaning. That just
Yep.
isn't a thing that matters to them. And then we also feel somewhat alienated from the believers in our lives in that they feel like they have the answer, and so that doesn't need to be discussed. So, what does one do when you are on this side of deconversion and you are seeking meaning and trying to find the people around you who would be interested in having that conversation?
You're absolutely right. And my experience is exactly the same. You have this, when your non-Christian friends kind of ask, they're asking out of curiosity. But when you start talking about, your experiences as a Christian and the fact that, for me, I was very much of the charismatic wing. I was all into the whole Toronto blessing when that was a
Right,
thing
right.
in the mid 1990s. So you start describing what you used to do under the Holy Spirit to your non-Christian friends. They think, "What on
Exactly.
earth?"
Yeah,
It's to be fair, it's an entertaining conversation over a couple of beers,
sure.
but they don't get it. They've got no frame to understand what on earth you're talking about. They just think you're mad.
Exactly. Yeah.
I desperately want to have this conversation with my Christian friends. And unfortunately, when you leave the church, a lot of those relationships ended with it, which was always going to be the way. Sad though that is, and I can tell you, we did everything we could to maintain a lot of relationships, but it was a bit of one-way traffic, and so
Right.
that all went by the way. Not totally. There's, there are exceptions, and those people know who they are, and I am eternally grateful to them. Eternally grateful.
You find out who your real friends are for sure.
You
Yeah.
find out who your real friends are, and actually that's the quality friendship seems to matter more than anything
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
So a lot of Christians, they find this either threatening or embarrassing or uncomfortable, so they don't want to talk about it either. So you're right, and I guess that's been part of my search for all these 12 years, since then. Interestingly, and also as others have said on your podcast, we miss being part of a group.
Sure.
We are social beings, and so what do we do when you move out of the church? And it's interesting. The past few months, I've been very active in local. I've been actually attending on off for a number of months previously before lockdown. We have so-called Sunday Assembly,
Yeah.
which, as a movement, is a basically it's a secular church, and it feels and looks like a church in many ways. And we've been meeting online every week. Pretty much through lockdown, I started attending for the past few months and have got increasingly involved. And so the Sunday Assembly is a great movement. There are a number of Sunday Assemblies in the US. But basically, it's a fantastic opportunity to get together. There will be a song, there'll be a secular song, there might be a Beatles song, it might be Elvis, just a bit of communal singing.
Uh huh.
And although at the moment it's a guy performing on our behalf on Zoom. There will be some poetry. There'll be some fantastic poetry, wonderful stuff. There will be a speaker who will speak about any aspect. It can be community work. It can be some kind of art movement they're involved in.
Okay.
A million and one things. So, for example, we had a speaker a few weeks ago who was the editor of the Guinness Book of Records, and they're talking about his experience of world record breakers around the world
Uh huh.
and his experience of meeting them. All sorts of fantastic, talks, a time for reflection, and a bit of social time afterwards. So that has been a great help to me, actually, I have to say, in terms of finding a replacement for that community. But that's a secular community, and although there are a few ex-churchy types in that group, that's not really what it's for.
Right.
There is, I have actually, again, before lockdown, through the Humanist Society over here, they do put on a couple of meetings for people who have walked away from faith, in that so-called apostates, and that's been remarkable. Met with
Okay.
them on two or three occasions in Manchester, and that's people who were, not just former Christians. There are a lot of ex-Muslims in that
Sure.
group,
Yeah.
ex very traditional Jewish,
Okay.
Hasidic Jewish type experiences of faith, Jehovah's Witnesses. And again, it's really interesting. Everybody's journey, the similarities between us all and our journey out of faith.
Yeah.
Now, for some of these people, the losing their faith has cost them far more than it ever cost me.
Right.
Because you are, you're part of the whole community, and you are. it's cost them everything. So I have nothing but admiration for some of these people for what, but out of their integrity, they couldn't just no longer carry on pretending to be something that they weren't.
Yeah.
Remarkable people. So we're not alone, and that's what has been encouraging. It's taken me a bit of time to catch up with the resources that are available, like your podcast and the Voice of Deconversion, others. Lots of people have a similar story, and to know that you're not alone in that journey is fantastic. The opportunity to talk about it, though, yeah, that's still, I think, and I do, appreciate that, David. That's something you're exploring. Some kind of forum where we can, talk these things through and let's just listen to each other. There's definitely a place for that.
Yeah, I definitely wish I had better answers.
Yeah.
I am definitely exploring that right now, how we might make something like that happen. I think what you've just described, though, is so important too that, although the specifics will be different, the faith traditions we came from,
Mm,
the details might differ. There are so many commonalities, regardless if you were Jewish, Muslim, Hindu,
no
Christian, what
question.
have you. It's like it's all so similar. One of the things I often tell people is go listen to an apologist for a different faith.
Absolutely.
You're going to hear exactly the same arguments. The arguments are going to be exactly the same. And obviously, they're arguing for a completely different religious tradition that is diametrically opposed to the one that you might have grown up in.
I've been exposed to the world of apologetics for approximately 6 months. So I've been on a very rapid journey with this,
Okay.
from listening to some stuff at the very beginning to where I am now, and particularly again listening to. And I do think Justin Burley does a great job with his series, Unbelievable Podcasts, and
Yeah.
but I've condensed 10+ years of his podcasts into the past 6 months,
Oh,
and you
wow.
very quickly realise they've not really moved anywhere. it
Yes.
is it is the same arguments 10+ years ago that are being regurgitated now, and you kind of think, wow, that's kind of interesting. And also occasionally we'll interview people from a different faith, and even more so, I find it even more interesting when it's two Christians talking about an aspect of theology. There might be the charismatic, wing
Sure.
of the church versus the cessationist wing of the church.
Right.
Fascinating, and but you kind of think, well, the same conversation been taking place 20, 30 years ago. We're really not anywhere different with it.
I would take it further than that. The apologetics world is still doing variations on the scholastics. I mean, the arguments really haven't changed.
No question.
They've gotten subtler. I had Brian Blaze on recently. We talked about Bayes' theorem.
Yes, you did, and that was excellent. Yes.
Yeah, so it definitely they're better at hiding
Oh,
where
yeah.
they are inserting information, that kind of thing. But honestly, I had basically the same experience that you did. That I definitely dove into Unbelievable and listening to apologetics and reading apologetics early on, and I finally realized I've seen this argument in 10 different flavors, but it's basically the same thing. And it has refutations that are hundreds of years old. and
Absolutely.
and so we really honestly we haven't moved the ball forward in any
There's
way.
every argument suddenly comes with a massive gear change of a sudden,
Right.
either a sudden insert of a personal experience that validates everything, or an assumption. Hang on, whoa, where did that come from?
Right.
It's
exactly.
fascinating.
I do want to drop apologetics. We could go on and on this, but the other thing that just one more comment, and that is that my experience with apologists is they want to set the groundwork and then quickly move forward to the conclusion.
100%.
And what I find difficult is I'm saying, hey, my problem isn't with your conclusion. My problem is with premise one,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like it's at the beginning that everything is falling apart. And
yeah.
it's beautiful if you accept premise one, where you get to. But the whole idea of science and mathematics and this idea of learning is that you have to know that foundation is true before you can get to something beautiful and complicated.
I've come to believe actually the apologists, their role isn't to convert. Their role is to stop people deconverting. I think their role
Absolutely.
is to, and that, I joked earlier. I think I built most of my Christian teaching off the back of knowing slightly more than the people
Yes.
I was talking to.
Yes.
And I suspect a lot of apologists, they would be speaking to a largely willing crowd and sound convincing, and just give them enough to keep them within that cognitive dissonance long enough to still identify as a Christian.
Right. Okay. So I do want to drop apologetics.
Okay, okay.
I do want to return now to finding meaning. I think,
Yes.
you and I have been doing this a few years and have maybe a sense of how meaning works for us. And I'm about to have you tell us that. But I want to keep in mind the listener who might be right at the beginning of, if I let go of God and this thing that has provided meaning for me for decades, maybe my entire life, what now? How did you answer that for yourself, and where are you at now?
Wow. Okay. There's still so much to wonder at. There is still
Mm,
so much to allow you to sit back and just go, wow, that's incredible. I can remember one of my, and we're not very, as we tend to lapse into spiritual language, don't we? And
sure.
because that's part of our culture, and particularly those of us from a Christian background. But one of my spiritual experiences I remember was after becoming deconverting and identifying as an atheist, going to my favourite place of worship, which is the British Museum,
Okay.
and wandering around the British Museum, and there was this hands-on display, and you could pick up these various artifacts. And the guy was there explaining what they were, and he handed me this stone that had been shaped and hewn. It was basically a hand axe, and this had been found in Tanzania. And he said that this had been formed by a pre-human hominid some 400, 500,000 years ago.
Wow.
And I can remember holding that and thinking, half a million years ago, this was held by a pre-human, distant evolutionary relative of mine,
Mm.
and that just blowing me away. So there's much to wonder at. So there's still. Are we allowed to use the word transcendent?
Sure.
I think just that which completely expands your mind.
Sure.
So there's meaning in that, but above all else, I think there's meaning in relationship. And I would encourage anyone who's going through this experience that will not change.
Yeah.
The quality of relationships, the way you identify in the relationships that you have, you'll find the relationships that matter. And also, don't stop giving. I think that is so important. I say this again and again. Whatever journey you're on, there are people out there who still need you. And however you're feeling at the moment, you will find meaning in reaching out and helping those less fortunate than yourselves.
Mm. Yeah.
Now, what is the basis of that altruistic drive in all of us? I don't know. Well, I think there's perfectly rational explanations for that, but go with that. That will again serve to give your life meaning as you
Yes.
go forward. Because you've got, you've not, as it turns out, we haven't got an eternity. You've got 70, 80 years of life. So let's make the most. There's a fantastic quote actually on one of my favorite films is It's a Wonderful Life.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
And on the wall in the office of in the I'm sure if you're familiar with the film before
Yes. Yeah.
I'm assuming that, of course. I watch it every Christmas and I bawl my eyes out every time.
Yes.
It completely breaks me. And on the wall and in the office in the building society, building union that he
Right.
runs, is a picture, and then the quote on the picture is, all you can take with you is what you've given away.
Mm.
And I thought, yeah, I want my life to be defined by what I've given. And if I can do that, then that gives me enough meaning.
Wow. The thing I want to pick up on here is relationships, right?
Yes,
I think on this side of faith, I realize just how truly that is of the greatest value. The connection to my family, to friends, to colleagues, to community members, that we have the privilege of being conscious next to each other, with each other, in
absolutely.
connection to each other, and that is truly the most meaningful thing in our lives.
Absolutely. And I do believe that COVID has brought this into relief for all of
Mm,
us. we're still in the UK in a level of lockdown. So all those relationships that we're able to have been I find that more difficult. But what has happened, and I've noticed this particularly, blokes of us. I'm going, yeah, okay. There's a 54-year-old, midlife crisis bloke. Here I am,
Okay.
and we're the worst for reaching out and if we're struggling and making contact. I've had more conversations with men my age where we've been able to be honest about our struggles,
Uh-huh.
emotionally and mentally in the past 6 months than I've ever had.
Wow.
Or people I've not spoken to in a long time, but people who I've reached out or they've reached out to me, and we've been able to be completely honest. Either just through messaging or phone calls or whatever it may be. People saying what life's doing for them at the moment, and I think that and I believe that's been a sea change, and I believe that's going to carry on forward. I think that's been
Yeah.
good, and it's not enough. Tragically, I was involved in with a dental practice, not far from us, where the dental practitioner committed suicide a number of
Oh
months
no.
ago, and and that a tragic situation for all sorts of reasons. But he was isolated. He was alone
Right.
in many ways, and that's not the way it's meant to be. That's not the way we're meant to be. That's what that I am grateful for the people I can reach out to, and humbled by those who have reached out to me as well.
This idea of giving away and valuing relationships, I mean, you're really describing what I'm trying to capture with this idea of secular grace. It is
Grace, absolutely.
this idea of just being intentional about connecting with people, right? And you've really nailed it there by saying men in particular, maybe older men like ourselves even more so, may find it difficult to be vulnerable, to even be
Yeah,
in the circumstance in which one could be vulnerable.
yeah,
And so it actually takes work to do that. And you have to be intentional about that. And yet, the value you get back, the catharsis you
100%,
experience personally is definitely worth it.
100%, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, it is. It's although it is sacrificial, the payback is so much more.
Right.
Yes, so I'm just looking at you. So Sunday Assembly, the motto is, because it just fit in what we're saying. The motto is live better, help often, wonder more.
Mm.
Now yeah, that's not bad.
Yes, that's pretty good.
That pretty much sums it up.
Ian, I've got one more topic that I had planned to chat with you about, and I'll just set it up here. One major difference between the U.S. and the U.K. is the age of the architecture in the UK and Europe, right? I'm on the West Coast, right? There's nothing that's 200 years old even. That's just it's ridiculous. And you might have a building from the 13th century, right?
Indeed, indeed.
But one of the things that strike me, I've had the privilege of being able to be in the UK a couple of times, in London specifically, is
Excellent.
the cathedrals.
Yeah,
So I've been to St. Paul's and I've been on the outside of a number of other cathedrals. But one of the things that struck me going there as a deconvert after the loss of faith was the recognition that cathedrals are designed to elicit awe.
absolutely.
You can go and sit down in a cathedral, and I don't care if you're the hardest of atheists, you are going to feel something.
Yeah,
And I'm, from my perspective, that's perfectly natural. That the architects were geniuses. They were playing with light and sound
absolutely.
and beauty in the architecture, and they were intentionally designing the space to make one experience awe. I wonder if that's something that you've noticed living in the UK. Is that something that you seek out ever?
Well, as you can imagine, when it's when you've got Roman ruins on your doorstep, you kind of take
Right.
these things for granted.
Yes, exactly. That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Which is appalling. But no, you're absolutely right, and I completely identify with that experience. And though I actually have to say, COVID has kind of stopped that kind of
Sure.
experience more so recently. But nevertheless, you're right. I can remember for me, my experience actually happened to be in Rome, and
Okay.
again, as an atheist, it's fantastic. The churches there are incredible, and I can remember being going into St. Peter's and being absolutely floored by the majesty of it all.
Yeah.
And people use the phrase, the walls are soaked in prayers of the faithful, and on some level, you do get a sense that, yeah, that sense that over hundreds of years, the countless millions who have been in there through this building on their journey, and you do in some way identify with the wider human race as a consequence of being in a building like that. There's something to do with identifying with the eons of time. And
Right.
I think also the reality is, for all of us, we're the US, but certainly in the UK, our culture is dominated by Judean Christian ethic,
Yeah.
and we need to acknowledge it. And I'm grateful for that. There's a lot of that, which is good.
Right.
Lots of questions as well, which we won't go into, but a lot of that which is good. So I am grateful for that. But then I've had exactly the same experience. I can remember I was in Iman, in the Middle East,
Okay.
on a diving holiday with my other son, and we went into a massive mosque that had been built there, and it was beautiful and it was overwhelming.
Right.
It was a stun again, a sense of awe, and in the architecture there. So I'm happy to be in that moment and enjoy that moment, and feel that and express that. I have to say, COVID more so recently for me. COVID, I'm grateful for where we live. We live in a beautiful area, and just being able to go out for a walk, in the beautiful countryside around here. So I've got as much sense of awe and sense of my own mortality, and the
Mm.
fact I'm ultimately just a bunch of atoms that happen to have come together as a sentient being for that brief period of time, and to be able to enjoy that, and enjoy that sun, enjoy the way that light shines through that tree at that time. That life is an incredible, wonderful gift,
Mm. Yes.
and I'm happy to celebrate that.
Absolutely. One last thought here. I say often that those of us that are scientifically minded and the kind of traditional secular scientific mindset is so focused on the idea of the Copernican revolution
Yep.
that we are mediocrity, that we are nothing special, which is definitely true. Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong. Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong. The flip side of that coin is the rarity of sentience, the rarity of consciousness. And
100%.
on just that basis alone, the fact that you and I can talk to one another about the joy we have in life, the awe we experience, the love we have for our friends and family is meaningful in itself, right? That we can think thoughts at
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
is so rare,
Yeah.
depending on how you want to calculate it in the universe. Even if we find multitudes of other sentient beings, it's still a tremendous rarity. And just that alone, we can find deep and powerful meaning in that I'm alive and you're alive, and we have this joyous experience of connecting with one another.
Yeah. It must be God, mustn't it? Obviously. You're
Okay.
absolutely right, and let me just again, this is why I'm grateful to you and your podcast. And as I think I said to you just before we came on air, so to speak, I was listening to the podcast from Anna most recently,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a human being I've never met, but I found that a deeply, deeply moving story, and on
Yes.
so many levels in terms of what she said. I identified personally in terms of her experience. Identified with. She was talking about the experience of being at DTS, the Discipleship Training School, and I can
Yeah.
remember I actually did some work on a voluntary work as a dentist on it's actually a hospital ship called an organisation called Mercy Ships,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
on this
yeah.
particular. Okay, yes. So they did have a DTS on one of the ships. So I've met these people.
Okay.
So I kind of, yeah. I got what she was talking about there. But in particular, what she was talking about, the power of language
Mm.
and some of the things that we say. And the thing that really cut me has been, and again, this is all about the whole issue about the importance of relationships. And there's one relationship that's meant an awful lot to me with a guy called Phil. Phil, I know through the mission. as because I was, as being a youth worker. But we've maintained a friendship since then, and I can remember him. We went out for a drink in a pub a number of years. I think he'd been to university, back from his first year at university, going through some stuff. Sat down in the pub, and he came out as a gay. And I think I may have this wrong, and I apologise to Phil if I got this wrong, but I think I was the first person he told. Now I was still very much a Christian at the time,
Right.
so I went through all the gear changes of, this is a guy I cared for. How do I reconcile this with my, my Christianity? And I did, and to my great, great shame, and I cringe when I think about it, I did the whole, you know, love the sinner, hate the
Mm,
sin
yeah.
type thing. I may not have used it in those phrases, but I may have said that kind, and I was just reminded. I've been reminded of that twice recently, partly through what Anna said, and in her experience of, what is abuse, basically.
Right.
And I do sometimes. I've more recently looked back at some of the things I said as a young Christian, and maybe what I said from the pulpit, and I do worry, you know,
Mm,
what potential damage has been said by that, and that's a difficult thing to carry. But also, but Phil, bless him, as I say, he came out and. We talk about grace. Well, Phil was at the time and still is an atheist, and Phil showed great grace or
right.
tolerance. He just kind of put up with me this nonsense, and we've been able to maintain a long-standing friendship throughout that.
Oh, good.
For which I'm eternally grateful. Well, Sarah and I attended his marriage to Steve a number of years ago, and Phil and Steve are our closest friends now in many, many ways. In fact, you know, we're planning for post lockdown and booking in meals. Phil and Steve are going to be the first people we'll meet up with. They are just they're just wonderful human beings, and graceful and forgiving. And I was talking to Phil recently, or messaging Phil recently, because there's been a series, and I'm sure it must be available over in the US, called "It's a Sin."
Okay.
I think you have the BBC iPlayer over there, and I
Yeah.
do
Okay.
recommend you look it out. It is an amazing short series, and looking about the whole AIDS crisis when it first came to light in London. So this was a few years behind when it first became an issue in New York and Chicago and the like. And it's a glorious, it's heartbreaking, it's harrowing, but a
Yeah.
glorious celebration of how the gay community dealt with that, both good and bad.
Sure.
And but the acts of grace and service and love that was shown, within that community, and and from a few forward-thinking people from outside, is deeply humbling. And I can remember, when the AIDS crisis, when I was a student at the time, and you think about how some Christians respond to that, to the gay plague, and we
Yeah.
look back with great shame at some of the language that we used. I'm just eternally grateful that we're in a much better place now. Look at
Right.
as a society, in spite of what some people wanted, we can celebrate life together. And so for people like Phil and Steve, I'm forever grateful.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that was another surprise to me was feeling released to love people more.
Yes,
You would not expect that, right? That is not the thing that you think. You think that as a Christian that you would, you're supposed to have the Holy Spirit who's loving through you, right? But then on this side of faith, letting go of that, you realize that I can embrace humanity and all of its diversity and
you're right. And you've got no other agenda. You're not there.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You can just go about the business of caring for people and not have all of those other restrictions. Yeah.
that's a really good point. Yeah.
Ian, I like to ask people, do you have recommendations for resources? Not this podcast, but any other podcasts, any YouTube channels, any books that were particularly meaningful for you?
So podcasts that I've been listening, Voices of Deconversion, we talked about
Right.
previously, from Stephen Hilton. I think I found that profoundly helpful.
He's amazing.
Lots of stories of a similar journey, and it's always good to listen to other people's stories. Another podcast I found really helpful is called When Belief Dies.
Yeah. Sam.
Okay, Sam, I think you've spoken to Sam, haven't you?
Yes. Yes.
I've found what he said very, very helpful. The Still Unbelievable podcasts,
Friends of the podcast. Yeah. Yeah.
very much so. I would actually recommend. So on the question, actually, one podcast I listened to, what I would specifically recommend, which I think Matthew from Still Unbelievable interviewed a guy called Steve Chalk, who is still
Yes.
he's a guy worth talking to. I would suggest, if you wanted someone, to come on your podcast to talk to, who's still a Christian. I mean, he's been through it in terms of, some of his expressions of his theology has changed over the years, and he's taken a lot of abuse from within the evangelical church. But in terms of what he's doing for the disenfranchised, the disillusioned, the poor in society. A remarkable guy. So Steve Chalk, an incredible guy. Yeah, that podcast, I'll send the link for that. I think he's an incredible person.
Yeah.
Books, there's a really good book by, I was looking this up recently, called Faithiest, a guy called Chris Stedman.
Yeah. Yes.
So his book Faithiest, and that's again his account of journey out of evangelical Christianity to becoming a humanist chaplain. I think he is now.
Yeah.
I found that very, very helpful as well.
Yeah, he's amazing too. Chris, if you're listening, get in touch.
He'd be great. Yeah, he'd be great to talk to. You're right, absolutely. There's a million other podcasts. I shall ping something over to you if I can find them.
Ian, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Final thoughts on the episode. As you could hear, Ian is an amazing person. The joy and the wonder and his love for humanity comes through in everything he discusses. Just a quick quote here. He says, "So there is so much to wonder at. Are we allowed to use the word transcendent? Just that which completely expands your mind. So there is meaning in that. Above all else, I think there is meaning in relationship, and for anyone going through this deconversion process, that will not change. You will find the relationships that matter. And also, don't stop giving. You will find meaning in reaching out and helping those less fortunate than yourself. That will serve to give your life meaning." Ian is a quote factory. I loved the way he described meaning making in one's life post deconversion. He also shows such great compassion for those people who are still in their belief. He shows a great openness to the diversity of religious experiences, including his friendships with Muslim women who pray for him, which he acknowledges is them showing him love. I just love Ian's attitude about life. I was moved greatly to hear about his son, Sam, having cystic fibrosis and the obvious concern that you would have during the time of COVID. But as Ian points out, he has been preparing for the loss of his son since his son was born. I can't imagine what that is like. And I can't imagine what it might be like to try to do that alone. I hope that many people will come alongside Ian and his wife Sarah and his son Sam, as well as his father, who is dealing with Alzheimer's as well, and just love on them constantly. That is what we need from each other. That is secular grace. I want to thank Ian for being on the podcast, for sharing his great wisdom, for showing such great compassion. I think there will be many people who are listening who can relate to parts of your story, and you have told it so well. Thank you, sir. I mentioned both in the podcast and in the intro this idea of independently deriving some of these ideas, and I want to just expand upon that. I joke that everything that I say is derivative, and what I mean by that is it's pulling this out of the zeitgeist of the great thinkers of our time, the great thinkers of history, and my own personal experience. But even though it's derivative, it is independently derived. When I talk about secular grace, these ideas I feel like I have worked on for years. And so it's wonderful, fascinating, and amazing to run into someone who expresses the same ideas, maybe not using the exact same terms, and has derived the same conclusions, specifically about relationships being the greatest meaning in our lives. That is secular grace. I am grateful to Ian for expressing it so well. To grossly oversimplify, I often say the secular spirituality ABCs are awe, belonging, and connection. Awe is all about the wonder that Ian expressed of recognizing the age of the universe, the age of the human race, and sitting in a cathedral and experiencing awe. Belonging is that sense of being a part of community and knowing that those people have your back, that they love you and care about you, that you are a part of a tribe, you're a part of a team. And connection is what you've been listening to today. That is two human beings being able to be vulnerable with one another, to express deeply held, deeply felt, important, meaningful ideas to one another and share in that together. That human connection, I personally think, is the greatest meaning in the universe. And I hope and wish that all of you experience that kind of connection with as many people as possible. That is your Secular Grace thought of the week. And until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Deconversion, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.